started. So we're now live. So Larry, on to you.
All right. So I think most of us, or most of those of you who have joined us today, have joined us for some of the other classes, or the other gatherings that we did. And anyway, Nick and I have been, we've been buddies and colleagues since the early 90s, as we've mentioned before. And we've done these, become fast friends. And over the years, we do these creative collaboration conversations where we meet here on Zoom and talk about some aspect of life and explore all of its subtleties and nuances. And we like to call them webversations. Speaking of words that we make up. So it's been an interesting journey, and I've been lucky enough to have read most, if not all, of Nick's books. Not all of them all the way through, I will admit, but I did finish the Undiscovered Country Friday. So I made it all the way through and really enjoyed the last section of the book, which we're going to get into here today. And I do want to share one quick little personal relevance. There's a section in the book where he shares a poem called "Why I Became a Poet," and shares a bit about his experience with the Marie Kondo method of basically going through your stuff and clearing it out based on what brings you joy or not. And it really, I really engaged the question in that section of, what has value in my life? And so I've been pondering that ever since Friday, since I read it. And so Nick, my question for you to start us off with is, each of the four quadrants has a philosophical question and a poetic question. And so how do they relate to each other as you've laid it out in the book?
Yeah, the philosophical question for me, when I was creating this map and I came up with the idea of the outer world, the inner world, the known and the unknown, and then created the four quadrants, each quadrant then became a holder of a kind of experience. So the known, like we've gone through the known inner world, what's the container for our relationship to ourself, the known inner world. And so when I was thinking of what does each of these quadrants hold as a container, then that opened up the kind of question that we might be working with in that. And philosophically, I think the philosophical questions are philosophical because they're perennial. Perennial meaning we have to constantly revisit them. The question of who are you is not one you can answer because you change. You're not the same person you were when you were a teenager. You had certain beliefs and desires and wishes and ideas about yourself then that you probably don't hold now. And since we're evolving beings on the planet, this identity, this thing that we think of as ourself, does shift and change. And so that question philosophically, I think, becomes how this is a map that's different than a map that's just of a terrain. It's really a map of a kind of engagement we have with the question. So the philosophical question are the ones that's been around here for thousands of years. But to me, the philosophical questions really take us on an intellectual journey, usually. It's like we're trying to intellectually answer that question. And I really wanted to find a way to ask a similar question from a more metaphoric or more soulful place, I'll call it soulful place, which would engage a deeper level of ourselves. And so for me, that meant thinking of that quadrant, and then what is the poetic question that would hold that? So for this one, the philosophical question for the unknown outer world is, why are we here? What are we here to do? What are we here to bring about in the world, and how do we engage the world out there that's beyond us? So why are we here is the question that's philosophical for that. And for me then, the poetic question was, how willing are we, or how far are we willing to extend the reach of our heart into the world? Because when we get to that edge of the unknown, where we're engaging life and bringing our gifts to the world, or we're responding to the call of life, to me, that I think is best answered from that, what I would again call that soulful place, that place of heart and of engagement that's more 100% rather than just our intellectual response to it. So for me, that's the balance between them. So the philosophical question is a way in which the map engages, that part of the map engages you, and repeatedly in new ways as you go through different iterations in life. And then the poetic question is an invitation to take that to a deeper level, rather than just giving your intellectual answer, to take it to a deeper level. And at that deeper level, I think the answers you have from a cognitive level change over time. Because it would be very easy to say, oh, I answered that, it's checked off the list and it's done. But I think the poetic question demands a different kind of response. That's why I love poetry, because it demands a different kind of engagement, a deeper engagement, more full expression of yourself, or soulful engagement.
Nice. Yeah, and just as partly as a way of kind of backtracking our previous sessions, so our first session this month, we talked about the known inner world, and then we went to the known unknown inner world. And then last time we did the known outer world, and now this time we're exploring the known unknown outer world. And I'd be curious, how do they work together as a path in the way you've envisioned it, as we lead into exploring this fourth quadrant?
I love this question. You know, what we haven't explored a lot here, which is on the map, is the center of the map, which is the inner sanctuary. And the idea in the title of the book, and I think in this work, is this inner world is an undiscovered country. And in that undiscovered country, there's what you could call a heartland. A heartland, a space that you engage with the world, and with both your inner world and the outer world, from the place of the heart. Again, I'm kind of describing that as a soulful kind of engagement. It's more than our intellectual understanding. It's more than the way we parse things or try to understand things. It really engages a greater part of ourselves. You know? So to me, the path is what Carlos Castaneda would call walking a path with heart. But the question is, you know, how do we know we're on a path with heart? And what would be indicators when we've wavered from that path? And I think, again, we could answer that intellectually and say, okay, I'm on a path with heart, and then just proceed. And I know this has happened for me. I can be on what I think is a path for heart and find that it no longer holds that engagement for me. Now, that doesn't mean I should change the path. I may need to do something different to re-engage that heartfelt connection with it. Or I may need to consider changing the path. There's a poem I'd love to share today, in fact, that's on that question of when are we on a path with heart and when not? And how do we know the difference? And how do we track that? To me, that's what living from your heart means, is that you continually revisit that question to find the answer that's both intellectually acceptable to you, but also really engages you on that deeper level, in the part of you that does know whether that's true or not.
So I love this idea of a path with heart, and knowing when I've had several times in my life where when I made a choice, it's like all the doors opened up, like everything just lined up, and I felt like supported by the universe or something like that. Like there was some greater force that I was either aligned with it or it was helping me in some way. And so when you in this section where you talk about, what does it mean to extend the reach of your heart into the world as a path with heart? How does that relate to the philosophical question of like, why am I here? Why are we here?
Yeah. It's interesting. Just a kind of a quick note, and I might have mentioned this story before. In the mid-70s, I was working at a crisis center, dealing with callers who were thinking of committing suicide, and one of them we weren't able to save one evening. And in that time, I had been trying to answer these questions about death and dying, which were on the wall at the crisis center. And I was answering these questions in my journal, and I was really not satisfied with my answers. I didn't feel like they were really capturing or really engaging me with a genuine dialogue, I guess you could say, with death and what death might mean and how that might be, how I might deal with death in my life. And so coming home that night, frustrated with this situation, I started writing in my journal as if having a dialogue with death. Death asked me, where are you? And I realized that we're sitting on a grave. It was like I was playing chess with death on a grave. Where are you? Or, we're on a grave. Whose grave is it? My own. Where's the grave? It's in a graveyard. Where's the graveyard? It's in a country. And death eventually gave me the assignment to go find out who, what that country is and who rules the land. And I started writing this story and got to this very painful place where I was kind of confronting my own negative evaluations about myself. And in that time, it got scary to me, literally, and I stopped writing. And I, over the years, had this memory of this very awful scene that involved a dead baby, and thought that's an awful place for that to end. And finally, I went back 20 or 30 years later in 2007, and I dug out that journal and read it, and it didn't end where I thought it ended. It went on to this place where I was before a judge, and the judge was asking me questions, which I couldn't answer very well. And finally he said, do you have anything to say for yourself? And I said, no, I don't really have anything to justify my life, basically. But I said, can I ask a question? The judge says, yes, you can ask one question, but be careful what question you ask because your life depends on it. And I think that question had been lingering under the surface for 30 years. So I picked up that story and decided that it was time for me to ask that question. And as I started taking the story forward, the question that formed was, why am I here? And the way it formed in my mind is, why am I, in terms of my unique background, my unique experiences, what I've learned, the way I think, my perceptions, why am I, as my unique person, here in this unique situation? Which can only be answered per situation. I could say, why am I here in life? That's a big one. But I think your purpose may change depending on the context that you're in and what life is calling out for you. In the COVID situation, life is calling out something different from us than it did before COVID. And we could try to stay on the same idea that we've been on before, which may be appropriate, but we may be totally missing the mark of what we're here to do because we thought we answered the question. So I love holding that question of, why am I, my unique self, here in this unique situation? Because then it's a living question. It's a question you go back to and you answer again each time. So for me, extending the reach of the heart means that you take that kind of stance in a serious and proactive way. In other words, you don't just assume because you've answered the question why you're here before that that's going to always be true in every situation. And then I think you become more engaged in you could say, a living reality with the world and with life, because it's updating, it's changing. It's challenging you to bring out new things and different things. So for me, extending the reach of your heart means you go back to that place. Like, what's life calling out that, that's touching my heart, or that's precious to me that I need to do in this moment, or that I need to stand up and defend because this is critical enough that I think it needs a stand. That you have to go to the heart for. So that's why it's called extending the reach of your heart. Life presents an issue. How do you meet it heartfully? How do you meet it from that place? And that's why I love the idea of the path with heart as well. That's kind of the merge or marriage of those.
Nice. Another distinction that really touched me that just came up as you were talking and I forgive me if my language isn't exactly right and how you used it in the book, but you make a distinction between living a life of personal mastery versus personal mystery, or something to that effect. And I thought that was very intriguing. To how do you find a sense of okayness with not knowing?
Yeah.
And to be open to that mysteriousness of not only life, but of the mystery of who we are. Yeah. and to be continually asking those questions to explore the mystery. So if you wouldn't mind commenting a bit on that, and then tell us a bit more about the tasks of this quadrant.
Yeah. Well, the distinction is between self-mastery. So often out there in the world, we're encouraged to, and this value of mastering yourself is highlighted. And I believe that the whole idea of self-mastery actually is a bit misleading, because it implies that there's a relationship with yourself in which there's this thing, you might call it your conscious mind or whatever, that's mastery over this other part of you that it kind of implies is then the slave, master-slave kind of relationship, or certainly, you know, like ruler and then subject kind of relationship. And I think that's actually misguided, because the conscious mind is actually the smallest part of our being. All the research in the past 30, 40 years, you could actually go back to Freud, about the unconscious has gradually revealed that the vast majority of our functioning is unconscious, is out of our awareness. And that vast majority of our functioning is taking care of so many things for us, and has accumulated a kind of wisdom that we aren't necessarily privy to or aware of. And we oftentimes are expressing that in our world. Now, that can have a negative side to it with things that we do in the world that we don't like. So there is this dynamic of how do we relate to this greater part of ourselves that actually is, I believe, more running the show than the conscious mind. So for me, then the kind of relationship that invites that is one I call self-mystery. When we recognize that we are literally a mystery, we'll never fully know ourselves. We'll never be fully in charge of ourselves. You know, especially as people age and the things they took for granted in their body no longer function quite the same way. And I think that really highlights this thing that we're, you know, called the body and the inner world that we're interacting with, that, you know, does have its own life, so to speak. And so for me, the self-mystery is an invitation into a relationship with yourself that's more, I think, genuine and real, and invites a level of automaticity that you can move forward with those natural patterns in ways that you're not trying to control your life, and therefore you're more likely to be living your life. So it's about how do we negotiate those things inside. And that's a lot of what I think this path with heart is, you know, walking the undiscovered country, is learning how we really live in relationship with ourselves in a way in which the parts are pretty much happy together. There's a, you know, a relative calm, a relative harmony, I guess you could say. And in terms of the task, so, you know, when I was creating this, to a certain degree, you know, these things are just made up. They were my best guess. And when I thought of what's the unknown outer world, well, that's about extending our heart into the world. It's stepping into that unknown. It's doing our best to live whatever might be our mission or our purpose, fulfilling that, and being open to guidance from inside of us or from the cues in the world about what that means in practical situations. So one part of that is our ability to enter the unknown. So that's one of the tasks. How do we engage life knowing that we really do not know what's going to happen in the next minute? We really don't know what's going to happen this day. We can make good predictions because it's probably going to go a certain way, but we really don't know. You know, this is really highlighted when there's a tragic incident in somebody's life. You know, they slip on the steps and happen to hit their head in a certain way, and they're paralyzed for the rest of their life. You know, there was an instant when everything changed. And then there's, you know, the great blessings in our life. You know, the moment when they pull back the curtains. This is a story from a friend of mine. The curtains were pulled back between the economy class and the business class. He was sitting in economy class, and the person who pulled back that curtain was a woman he fell in love with immediately, and who he later married, and they've been together 35 years. So, but there was that moment. His life changed in that moment. Everything he might have imagined before that suddenly got shifted in that moment. And so for me, it's like our willingness to engage with the unknown. So that's one task. The second task is to realize the degree to which we're living our dreams now. You know, like I'm living things in my life now that I dreamed before. So when I was early on in my NLP career, I started dreaming about training internationally, and I've trained internationally for years. When I started training internationally a lot, started dreaming about, man, it'd be nice to have some chunk of time at home. Got this chunk of time at home right now. So it's like, to what degree are we living that dream now? And then the third part of it is the legacy that we leave. And so those are the three tasks. And I think this might be a good moment to just go on to this poem I mentioned earlier, Go Nowhere. which is about our relationship with the unknown. And this poem came up. I don't have the date right here on it, but I think it was 2 years ago, about that time, year and a half ago, somewhere in there, because most of the poems in this section were written in 2018, 2019. And so this one came up. And it came up at a time when some part of me was starting to recognize that what I had been doing wasn't feeling exactly right. I didn't, and again, when I sit down to write poems, I don't necessarily have I don't have a clear idea of what the poem is about. The poem reveals itself to me. And so a lot of times it starts out with a few lines. And this one started out with, I just wrote down, I refused to admit it. What I claimed was a path with heart had become a dry creek bed. And I think that, that feeling that it was capturing was a recognition that this path that I had devoted myself to and was following at the time was, something was off with it, something was missing. And by that, what I specifically mean is that, again, I was kind of engaged in writing poetry and wanting to make poetry a greater part of my life, but finding, and because of that, I think finding my old style of doing a lot of travel to do NLP and hypnotherapy training wasn't quite fulfilling me. So I was at, again, a crossroad. I've been at this crossroad probably 4 or 5 times over the past several years, but this was one of those times. So this started out, it's called Go Nowhere. I refused to admit it. What I claimed was a path with heart had become a dry creek bed. The old ones I met along the way laughed at how carefully I tread, trying not to scuff my boots on sun-baked rocks. I dismissed their cry that this used to be a mighty river, without realizing they were speaking of my life. I dismissed their cry that this used to be a mighty river, without realizing they were speaking of my life. I was always on my way to elsewhere, and what had been carved by a once vibrant flow made a convenient walkway. It's so much easier to put plans before people, to put purpose before presence, even though these are the best conditions for drought. I could have pushed on, counting the blessings in a world without mosquitoes and with plenty of stones for my grave. You may think I am crazy when I say, I would rather go nowhere. But you have to stay in one place long enough to nurture seedlings. And little by little, drop by drop, one day you lift your head and find yourself surrounded by an orchard in blossom. It's so much easier to put plans before people, to put purpose before presence, even though these are the best conditions for drought. And I think so often we get this idea of a direction or a path, we get some goal we're going towards, and the goal starts to override the living of our lives. We start to put that goal before other more precious things in life. And when that happens, I think that's when the path with heart, the one we thought was the path with heart, actually does become a dry creek bed. We're missing something. We're so focused on that distant arrival that we miss the actual footsteps we're walking on the earth at this time and the engagement with life through that process. And so for me, this kind of poetic engagement, this is when I talk about extending the reach of the heart into the world. So poetry is one way of engaging with that self-mystery, that part of me that might know something's off, but I don't necessarily recognize it on an intellectual level, or that part of me that actually knows I'm on the path, but I don't recognize it on an intellectual level. It's engaging with that, that moment in the life we're living at the time. I just noticed Jan Elfline put in the chat, Robert Dilt says, here tomorrow, gone today. And it's true. So all of us, we're living in that future moment rather than living in the moment now. So for me, that's again about our relationship with the unknown. That's about the self-mystery and finding out what the heart really has to tell us and being open to that information. So I'm not sure if that answered your question. I have to track back now to get the question that you asked, which was about the 3 tasks. And then I kind of went into this one.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that means there's 2 more tasks to explore.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, the second task, I mentioned the 3 tasks are entering the unknown, living the dream, which is the degree to which we recognize that the life we're living now is most likely, or at least to a limited degree, an outcome of what we might have dreamed earlier in our life. Or the second way of thinking of it is you could ask the question, in what way is the life I'm living now actually an expression of some deep desire or dream that we have? For instance, you know, I've been telling people for now a few years that I wanted to develop a local community, because my training over the years has been mainly overseas. And so I would be gone out of the local area. I'd spend less time, you know, much less time locally than I would in other places in the world. And a lot of my friends are out spread around the world. So I wanted to develop more of a local community, but was finding difficulty with inroads in that because I couldn't really commit myself to things in this area because I was traveling so much. So events that I might like to participate in regularly, I could only come occasionally. So I've always wanted to have, or have even espoused, wanting to have a local community. And now COVID came up. And in a way, I'm starting to live that engagement in the local world here around me, even though I'm in my home mostly, but still I have time to do it. And I can go to things regularly on Zoom. So it's you know, kind of, you know, to what degree are you actually living a dream now? And a poem I want to share with that is called Blink of an Eye. I'm scrolling down to get it in my digital copy of the book. And you know, the phrase blink of an eye, we often talk about this and use this phrase to describe that experience that many of us have of living our lives and then waking up one day and realizing what the hell happened. You know, it's like 10 years go by and suddenly you realize you've been working at a job, maybe you don't like it, or you're, you know, in a situation you don't like, and have been tolerating it, and then you wake up one day to how much time has passed. And that's partly where this poem came, a blink of an eye. Declare yourself. The laws of physics guarantee that only you occupy the space, while the wave of you streams in and between a collective of sentience. Just to kind of comment on that, you know, now we have so many airwaves of information flowing in the world around us. I mean, the phones pick it up, you know, devices pick it up, but those airwaves are also flowing through us. And I often wonder to what degree we, as receptive beings, are receiving those airwaves on some subtle level, maybe even understanding them more than we know. We have 1,000 voices going through us right now. When you think about all the digital information that's going through the world, I believe we have 1,000 voices going through us, or probably more. So this idea of we might occupy a physical space, but the world is also flowing in and out of us, and our spirit is flowing out of us into the world. So that's kind of the idea there. Declare yourself. The laws of physics guarantee that only you occupy the space, while the wave of you streams in and between a collective of sentience. And in the realm of vastness, the sweep of your hand ripples across time and space with unimaginable effect. Well, again, I really believe we do not know the impact we have on the world and on life. You know, the idea of 6 degrees of separation. You, through your connections, touch people who then touch people who then touch people. And the idea being that, you know, over a few iterations of that, you've literally touched everybody on the planet. Remember years ago, I was curious about this idea of the butterfly effect, which is a butterfly, you know, flapping its wings in South America would actually trigger a storm in Asia. That some small shift in a system can have tremendous impact as that ripples out and has effects. And I believe that the same thing could be true for us. That the presence we bring to another person or to the world in a moment could have rippling effects out across the world. And when I took that on, I began to be curious about, well, what state, if I were to enter into a state that could ripple out and affect the world, what state would I like that to be? What presence would I like to offer to the world that if that presence, if that way of being were to become a universal in the world, then what would I like that to be? And challenge myself then to step into that state. So that's kind of the idea there, you know. And in the realm of vastness, the sweep of your hand ripples across time and space with unimaginable effect. Take this solemn power to heart and let it be the rhythm of you until you come to know your edges with almost imperceptible nuance. Then you can give yourself ever so lightly to the world. The universe weeps when touched with such gentleness because it only takes a slight stir to trigger star birth and spin galaxies. That is why monks spend a lifetime courting stillness until one day the world changes in the blink of an eye. And so, you know, that blink of an eye can also be not just when we awaken to something that was happening from an unconscious level that we weren't aware of and that we finally discover it, but it can also be that we are practicing a way of being in the world. And then one day we wake up and recognize that way of being has become, you know, such a natural expression for us that it's now how we live our lives. And it can happen in the blink of an eye, even though it might have taken years of dedicated effort to get to that point. And to me, that's also why I think the path with heart is so important, because it takes heart. You know, it takes courage. It takes continually going back and realizing this is precious to get to that place where you can, I think, come to that space of knowing you're really living from the heart, truly and genuinely. I don't think I've achieved it. I get it in moments, you know, and that's why I'm doing this work, is because that's the place I want to get to. So blink of an eye, what way are you bringing some presence to the world and practicing that presence in a devoted way so that it can become the world you live in, basically. So living the dream is, in a way, that's a part of living the dream. There's two sides to that. Living the dream, one part of it is recognizing the degree to which you're living the things you dreamed before. But because you're living them now, we go on to another dream and we don't acknowledge or embrace the dream we're living. And the second part is practicing living the dream that you wish to bring to the world so that you can, with that blink of an eye experience, suddenly realize this is it, you're doing it.
You know, Nick, I really love this. And I think it might have been a distinction you and I talked about at some point of the difference between direction and destination. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, we might be organizing our lives to move in a particular direction, or, you know, that like being healthy, for example, might be a direction, whereas a destination might be a certain size and shape or a certain performance ability or something to that effect. Uh-huh. I remember recently reading a metaphor that really I thought was pretty powerful. And I read it on Facebook, so obviously it's true. But a plane, when it flies from one destination to another, is off course 98% of the time. And yet most planes arrive at their destination most of the time and close to on schedule, I mean, relatively speaking. And yet, how can something be off course 98% of the time and still arrive at its destination? And it's because of that pattern of course correction that the pilot uses the instrumentation and the landmarks and things to stay on course. And I think this book offers that as a way of helping people course correct, like to be able to look inside and go, am I in alignment with my path of heart? Am I going in the direction that I want to go, or am I pursuing my destination, which might be, you know, to leave a legacy of some kind. Mm-hmm. And so, which of course is the last task. Right. If you wouldn't mind speaking to that one.
Yeah, you know, this is a really interesting one because, you know, now in my life, I'm divorced, so I'm single. I don't have somebody who's here with me all the time. And every once in a while I'll think about, now if I were to pass away, somebody's probably going to go through my things at some point along the way. And while I was doing this Marie Kondo process that you mentioned earlier, Larry, this is what, a year and a half ago or so. And I literally was taking the Marie Kondo idea of going through everything that you have in your life, all the things in your life, basically, and asking the question, does this spark joy? And using that as a criteria for keeping it or letting it go. And there's some little variations from it. It's not always just on that. And I really thoroughly went through a lot of stuff. But when I got to my journals, that was a little bit more challenging, like, am I going to look at each individual journal and determine, does it spark joy? And, and I started thinking, because I have journals that I've kept since I was in high school. I have volume, literally a bookshelf in my garage filled with them, whole, 4 or 5 shelves of a bookshelf packed. And some of them are like all the way across, and then they're stacked on top of these journals. And so a question came, well, who's going to go through that stuff? Who's going to go through my, the stuff in my life? And I believe even if you have somebody that's totally devoted to you, and, when you go off to, the whatever realm we go up to, they're probably going to be challenged to go through your stuff for most of us in the Western world. And so this poem I wrote that actually you mentioned earlier, I'm going to share it now, Why I Became a Poet, actually was written during that time I was going through this Marie Kondo stuff and thinking about that, why I became a poet. If it were a penny for my thoughts, I would be ranked in the top 1%. And just kind of a comment on that, I do think a lot. So if it were a penny for my thoughts, I would be ranked in the top 1%, but it would be a riches of sublime ambiguity. If it were a train, just up ahead is a switch, and it can veer off into 100 different directions, each with a beautiful question to track. If it were an idea, it would be half-baked. A plan, it would be a lean-to. Soon I will make another trip to the recycling bin, then back to filtering through debris in the attic, rummaging through the clutter in the closet, searching through a lifetime of little loves and silly sorrows, of tiny griefs and brief gratitudes, all piled high in the hidden places with a sign for future historians proclaiming, this is how I lived. Whoever takes the time to mine my life should do it for love and not for money. Otherwise, it will take a lot of pennies to make it worthwhile. And some things just never add up. I know this because one day I realized I'm the one most qualified to do the job. And the reason that I came to that place was realizing that probably, I doubt that anybody's going to take the time or energy to go through my journals. I doubt that my poetry will even be read much beyond my life. There was a poet laureate named Don Hall who was interviewed by Terry Gross on NPR, and she asked him about his legacy. He was in his elder years at that point in time. She asked him about what legacy he would leave behind, and he made a very interesting comment. He said, if you look back on the history of writing, you can identify people who were at their time famous. They were well read, they were well known at the time they were alive. And now, they are virtually unknown, hardly ever read. He said, I do not anticipate that people are going to read much of my writing after I die. And then he went on to say, and actually it really doesn't matter because I won't be there anyway. And when I heard that, I realized that, like, my poetry is certainly not famous at all in the world of poetry. I'm not well known at all. I do have poems that have been, shared all over the world. They've been translated into different languages. Some people have told me they have a particular poem of mine that they like, that they refer to often. One person had one of my poems on his refrigerator, and you'd often revisit it. And so, I know my poems have been out there in the world doing things, but I really doubt that my work will be much read beyond my life. It's possible that it may be read, So the question is, what do we really leave behind when we leave? And I think that's when I go back to the comment I was making earlier about the way our presence touches other people. Whether they remember it or not, they've been touched, and their life has been shaped to some degree by the fact that you were here. The whole It's a Wonderful Life story kind of highlights that in a dramatic way. Where George Bailey, has this moment where he wants to commit suicide, and this angel comes down and says, he says, I wish I was never born. And this angel shows him the world as it would have been if he weren't born, And I think there's a degree to which that kind of quality is true in the world. The world would be a different place if you were not in it, because you've touched people in a certain way and shaped them in a certain way because of your presence here. And so for me, it goes back to that question of, how am I living? And how is the presence I'm bringing to the world offering something that I would like to go on in the world? And because that may be the most I can really do. Now, I do have one other comment I'll make about this. I did one time go to Asilomar to actually see David White, the poet, speak. While I was there sitting in the cafe with some of my friends, one of the park rangers, Asilomar is a state park in California, came to our table and was chatting with us and asked us why we were there. She was actually inviting us to go on a tour she was going to be giving, but we were going to be going to hear David speak. So we said we couldn't, we're going to see this poet. She goes, oh, I've been looking for a poet to write a poem that we could include in our Asilomar magazine that we do one every year annually. It's in every room. And I've been looking for a poet to write a poem for that. I said, I'll do it. So I wrote a poem and submitted it to her. And sure enough, they published it in their magazine at Asilomar. And the reason I tell it is because a couple of years later, I think it was 2013 when I did that. It was 2015, I think, or maybe 2016. I got an email from her saying, we're gonna be creating a time capsule, and we want to include your poem in the time capsule. Is that okay with you? And I said, absolutely. So unless there's some catastrophe that prevents that from happening, I know at least one of my poems will be read in 50 years. Yeah, so this idea of, who's going to mine our life but ourselves, and who's going to bring what we want to give to the world but ourselves. And I think we do that mostly through our presence. Even if we leave, money, or we leave buildings in our names and other things, those are nice and they have people remember you. But, I think that actually the greater impact you have is through your presence. There's a quote, I think it's Maya Angelou, who says, people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And I think there's some truth to that in the sense that it's your, the soulful engagement that touches people in a certain way that's the more important legacy that we leave behind. So for me, that's been how I've started to focus my attention around legacy, is in what way can I be the presence that I would like to give to the world?
That's wonderful, Nick. The depth and richness of this book is really impressive to me, and I'm so glad that you offered these 4 sessions to explore the book a little deeper. And we do have some time for some questions and comments, sharings, if you're up for entertaining a few.
Yeah, I'd love to entertain a few, so we'll open it up. Anybody have questions you'd like to ask? You could either put them in the chat or unmute yourself and speak.
I believe
Doreen.
Bob. Hi everybody. I believe Bob asked you to read a poem. I'd like to hear that one, please.
Bob, the one where he says a richness of sublime ambiguity.
No.
Oh, the Asilomar poem. Yeah,
yes.
I'd have to search that one up. It's not like immediately available, and I don't have it memorized. Let's see if I can remember the title of it. It's called A Refuge by the Sea. Maybe let me see if I can pull it up. A Refuge by the Sea. I don't think that's the title, but that's the line. That's what actually Asilomar means, is refuge by the sea. See if I can get it here. Yeah, the title is not A Refuge by the Sea. That's a line in it. Maybe the title is Asilomar. Let me try that and then see if I can pull it up. And then if I can't get it after a couple of attempts here, I'll beg your forgiveness because I won't be able to find it, I don't think. Yeah, it doesn't look like I'm going to be able to find it very easily.
That sort of segues into a comment that I had, Nick, and I'm always appreciative of new words in my life, and automaticity was one that I was like, what did he say? so thank you very much.
Yeah, if it's a single word that gets it, I love that. For me, as a poet, it's like when you get a word like that, your mind can go all kinds of places.
Certainly did.
Yeah. Automaticity, I'll say that for me, I got that word from Steve Gilligan, who's a hypnotherapist, studied with Milton Erickson, which is my background, and And Erickson himself talks about automaticity. I think I actually got it originally from Erickson, even maybe before Steve. So, but that idea of automaticity, it's a nice word.
Music.
Other comments or questions? Yeah, Sharon says, are the 4 quadrants related to the Enneagram concept? That's a great question. I don't know the Enneagram really well. I know of it. So I couldn't easily answer that question. I know that years ago, I was going through a difficult time in my own life, and I went to see an NLP therapist named Tom Condon, who is now well known in the world as an Enneagram specialist. And while I was working with Tom, I just kind of a little background. I had gone through a separation with my girlfriend, and it was a tough time. And my tendency is not to get depressed. I tend to be more optimistic and positive. People used to say, "Do you ever get depressed?" And my answer to that was, "Yeah, I tried that once." But Tom pointed out I was in this time where I was really struggling, and pointed out that I was denying my feeling by trying to move on to the next action, the next action, the next action. And he did this wonderful intervention. In the middle of one session, he was trying to point out that I wasn't really feeling my feelings. In the middle of this one session, he leaned over to me and he said, "Do you know that you've elevated denial to a way of life?" But then he really wanted to rub it in. He said, "It's totally okay if you want to live a shallow life." Now, you say live a shallow life to a poet, it's like a knife plunged in the heart. But at any rate, he's an Enneagram specialist, and he mentioned what he thought I was at the time. I don't know if I would totally agree with it, but that's the little bit I really know about the Enneagram. So I imagine not so much that it would be connected to the 4 quadrants, but it might be more connected to how you deal with the 4 quadrants. Your Enneagram style might determine a way of interacting with them that would be unique to that style, is my guess. Other questions or comments? Well, I'll share another poem here. Again, this one is in the section on leaving a legacy. And I wrote this when I was kind of falling in love with this woman. It never worked out, but and I was definitely falling in love with her, but she wasn't falling in love with me, I guess would be the way to put it. Anyway, she was, she's kind of a free spirit, and she was talking about wanting to go and live out herself. There's the way she put it, to go live out myself. And I thought that was a great phrase, live out yourself. And so I wrote this poem called No Greater Love, which I actually think is a great poem for parents, especially when the kids are leaving the house. When there's teenage years and you have to find a way of letting go and letting them, live their own life and letting them fall and pick themselves up, the kinds of things that's so hard to do. When you're a loving parent for somebody and you see them making mistakes that are, it's going to probably cause them trouble, but sometimes intervening then actually becomes more of a problem in the relationship than just letting the person have the fall. And so I wrote this poem called No Greater Love. My heart is big enough for you to roam wherever you wish and feel you loved. My patience is deeper than the canyon where my voice echoes in your absence, because I am here for you, whispering these words into your dreaming ears, which are timeless and know no boundaries. Go, live out yourself, and do so without apology, because no matter how far or how long you wander, I know that we all must take the steps on our own path. And there is no greater love than the love that gives you to yourself. My heart is big enough for you to roam wherever you wish and feel you loved. My patience is deeper than the canyon where my voice echoes in your absence, because I am here for you, whispering these words into your dreaming ears, which are timeless and know no boundaries. Go, live out yourself, and do so without apology, because no matter how far or how long you wander, I know that we all must take the steps on our own path. And there's no greater love than the love that gives you to yourself. So I think one of the beautiful things about legacy is if we can love a person into themselves. You know, wouldn't you love to have somebody in your life that truly loves you into yourself? What greater gift could you give? You know, there's a wonderful work that's being done or has been done by this nurse in Australia, Bronnie Ware, on the 5 regrets of the dying. She's a palliative care nurse and, you know, does hospice care. And she identified the common regrets that she heard over the years and identified 5 common regrets. And, you know, I'm not going to name all of them, but one of the common regrets that she heard from people was that I wish I had lived a life true to myself and not according to the expectations of others. And I think that that's a very deep truth in the Western world, because we tend to be more oriented towards individuation and individual expression than in the Eastern world, which might be more collective. But I think it's a basic human dilemma between being our authentic self on the one hand and belonging to a world that might want us to be otherwise. And that dynamic dilemma is one we have to revisit again and again and again in our life. I think that's part of this walking the undiscovered country and living from the heartland is how do we navigate that difference? And I think it's more challenging than we know because the world's impression on us is much deeper than we might ever guess. A lot of the goals and dreams that we cling to as our own were actually instilled in us by the culture and the world and our parents and others to the degree that we think they're our own when they might not actually be our own. And so I think that it's actually quite a challenge to find out what your heart is really about. It's not that easy to do. And that's why I think it takes the effort and the energy of doing work like this, whatever form it is, in order to really get to that place where you could understand who you are and what you're about. And I think that's also done by engaging with life when it presents us with something and really engaging with it almost from the standpoint of ethical dilemma. You know, what is the right thing for me to do? What's true to my heart? And what is precious in me that I love that I'm not willing to give up? And why am I not willing to give it up? What's so vital about it really behind the scenes or under the surface? Because sometimes we start to battle over something that's the wrapping around what we really want. And then the battle is for the wrapping, not for the desire. So, you know, this no greater love to really be in that space to love somebody into themselves.
That's an excellent poem. Did you give her a copy?
Yeah, I did. Yes. I'm sure she appreciated it, but it wasn't enough to sway her heart.
Oh, that's terrific. That's one of the best poems I've ever heard. I love it.
Yeah, and then a colleague of mine in the NLP world who teaches parenting skills has made that poem one of her, that she presents at all of her courses. And so it's really, I think, useful for parents. I kind of got that because I was at the NLPU, it's called, annual event, which happens in August, and people from all over the world came, and this one particular woman came, and she was going to do a presentation about parenting skills, and she asked me to get up and share this poem for her, and so she embraced it and took it from there. So,
can I ask a
Lynn,
question?
I thought you were pointing down at something. I guess you were pointing at somebody's hand was raised, maybe?
Oh,
yeah.
Can I, anybody else? I would.
No, go ahead, Nicholas. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Nick, for touching us so deeply and for doing this for us. And yeah, I really love your work, and I've started reading it. I will certainly continue to read it and also get the book. And yeah, it's very touching. And having said that, I need to ask something about the process of writing, because what you just shared about this legacy. Oh, there's some coming in now. So what you shared about this legacy that they have all these piles of paper, and I guess I'm a bit similar in that respect, because I also like writing. I like writing journals, but of course this question you asked is coming. Oh wait, what is it all for? And I wonder, do you also see a certain risk in writing to in a sense, like, distance yourself to the world. I mean, it's kind of, sometimes when I do writing, it also feels like a layer between me and the world.
Right.
And precisely this aspect of touching other people, it's like a different path, and it's like my way, like writing is my way to deal with things and to go into myself. But then what I actually want to do is want to get out into the world, and then I kind of write so that I don't need the text anymore, and then I'm kind of in the world again. I don't know if you know that process, if you can say something about that.
I love that whole dance that we have to do in terms of really being, you could say, in touch with life directly. You know, and I once had this idea, and I even wrote a poem about it a while back, about this sense of identity, you know, who we are and how we hold ourselves, being like we're like a hermit crab. And hermit crabs, what they do is they have, you know, a soft body, and they protect themselves by finding a shell that they actually burrow themselves into, and they carry this shell around. But then as they grow, they have to get a shell that's not so big, you know, it's too much to haul, and not so little that they can't grow into it. But then once they get to a point where it's no longer, I mean, they can't grow any further, they actually have to leave that shell and go to another shell. And I think identity is very much that way. It's like we have these ideas that are a shell that protect us and keep us safe. And we can kind of, you know, we can sense the world, but we're also kind of protected from it to a certain degree. And then there are times when we have to get out of that. We have to transition from one to another when we're totally, in a way, exposed to life, to the world. And I think that same idea could be said about anything that we put between us and the world. It serves a purpose and a function that's valuable in and of itself, but it also provides a limit that prevents us from something that's vital to us. So the question in my mind is, how do we part that veil, you know, more consciously and more often, so we can actually enter the unknown? That's really what this whole section is about. It's like, how do we part that veil and really open our heart to be touched by life? Which means that we might see a child with chocolate on its face in the street and find ourselves broken down in tears because we're touched by life in that moment. You know, and it's, you know, that's not the thing society likes to see from people typically. You know, you're in a meeting and somebody says something and, you know, it kind of touches you to the core. It's a business meeting. It's probably, so, you know, we have to have something that manages that. But at the same time, when we have that something, it limits us. And so that's the dance. And I think having that question, Nicholas, that's the most beautiful way to do it. It's like really hold that question. To what degree are these words serving to help me bring something forth or get in touch with something? And how can I mine that? And to what degree are these words actually becoming a barrier that's preventing me from really feeling and being in touch with life? There's no one right answer, I don't think, to that. I think it's the dance of the soul. That's why this sort of engaging with the unknown is so critical.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. You know, before we, it's like we're at an hour now, and before we run off, I would like to say that I've loved, first of all, thank you all for coming and joining me on this journey. I really appreciate your participation here. I am thinking about, I'm wanting to take this to the next level, which would be have a deeper dive into each of these. And I'm curious, I'm forming some ideas about how to do that. So I'm curious if you would be interested in a deeper dive, and if so, if you'd be interested in a deeper dive forming in certain ways. So what I mean by that is that I'm thinking of offering this exploration of the undiscovered country in maybe 4 one-day segments, or some breakdown that would be basically about 8 hours of time, either on one day or broken up in time, on each particular topic over about a 4-month period. So to do that, I created a little poll, and I'll just bring up the poll here. If you'd just be willing to, simple question here, and you can check all that apply to you, and just let me know, would you be interested in or consider doing a deeper dive into this? And if it were structured, would you prefer 4 full-day sessions, 1 per month for 4 months, or 8 half-day sessions, maybe twice per month, or maybe 1 week or weeknight would be a weekly 90-minute session for 16 weeks. and I'm still exploring this. Larry and I talked about it. What we would do in this deeper dive is we would present each of the sections, and we go over each of the tasks, so we'd spend more time on each one. And we would offer some guided exercises, offer some opportunity to do your own writing and exploration and sharing together on it. So it would be an opportunity both to engage yourself on a deeper level, but also to do that in a context where you get some guidance and you could get some ideas and input from other people as well. Looks like I think most everybody has replied, so I'll go ahead and share. So here's the results. So the biggest vote would be for one time per week for maybe 16 weeks, a 90-minute session. So that's really helpful for me to know that that might be something people would be more inclined to go for. And I think particularly because it most likely would be in Zoom, given our whole Zoom world, I'm thinking maybe starting somewhere around September. And if I were to do the 16-week night thing, it might be early September on a Tuesday or a Thursday, most likely. Evening is one option. But that's sort of where I'm thinking about that. Larry would participate, so we would be working together again on that. And it'd be great if you'd be willing to participate that. I'll let you know. I'll get you I'll post something to all of you when that comes about. So I'll stop sharing that. And I'll finish with maybe one last poem. I wrote this poem, I think it was 2000, on the evening of 2017, beginning of 2018. I wrote a poem called Grace, and I want to share that with you once I scroll and find it. So this was about 11 p.m. that evening, New Year's evening, going to be changing the year in the Western calendar, and I wrote this poem called Grace, and I think it's a good poem for ending this. Grace. Speak now what has never been spoken, because this year will soon turn to dust, and the bridge we walk across into tomorrow already burns under our feet. What we celebrate with fireworks at the stroke of midnight, with our glasses raised and a lover's kiss, with snapshots of joy we send across the world, is smoke and mirrors in the magic act of our appearance and disappearance. Let us thank our lucky stars for the miracle of being here at all, and for the astonishing beauty that you and I should have the good fortune to share this moment. Whatever effort we put into our arrival here is nothing compared to grace, which pours over us like an endless rain until we are soaked to the bone, until we drop to our knees, humbled by our origin and how far we have fallen, until we speak what has never been spoken, casting our magic dust across the bridge into tomorrow, praying for rain. You know, this whole idea that no matter how much we craft our lives and shape our lives and willfully move ourselves forward, we are totally supported by grace, you know, by the incredible privilege to be alive in the moment. And I think if we can feel that and sense that more frequently in our world, then we have a chance of living a life that when we come to the end of our days, we can look back and say, yeah, I did live true to myself as best I could. You know, I did live a life that I can genuinely say was authentically mine. So with that in mind, I want to thank you all for joining me on this journey and for being a part of our time together, and for your support of my book and my work. And I look forward to our next time together. And I noticed, Xavier, I didn't get a chance to say hello to you. If you're still there, let me see. I'll pull up gallery view. Are you still there, Xavier? Oh yeah, there you are. Just want to say hello. I've been meaning to contact you. Like I thought the other day, I got to contact Xavier. So we need to get together.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah. What a beautiful way to share this together. So happy to see all of you. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you for coming. I'm happy you're here. And thanks, Bob. I'm glad you joined us. You look so cool there in your backyard with a tree behind you. Jan, thank you. My pleasure for you being here. Jan, you know, is a world-renowned coach, and so great for you to be on the call. Niklas, whom I met through the generative change work and who's in Germany, thank you for being here. Lynn, who's an amazing poet in his own right, thank you. Sharon, too, another poet. Gay, another poet here in the local community. Hope, who I connected to through Generative Change, and Steve Gilligan, and Doreen, who has recently come into the poetry world. And people, by the way, people say about Doreen, if you want to have a poem read and that sounds lovely, let Doreen read it, because her voice is so wonderful. And she does wonderful poetry of her own.
Nick, I wanted to say I'm so sorry that I missed the previous 2 sessions, because I really feel that I've learned a lot. It's just phenomenal, and I'm very excited to read the book.
Well, thank you, and they are recorded. So if you want to see any of the previous ones, they're on YouTube, and I'll send out a link to everybody with the YouTube of this one and also the other one as well. So.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
And also Valerie, I think, is that Valerie down there still? Or no, that's Diane, I think. The picture of the dog. Yeah, Diane. So thanks, Diane. Diane's another one in our local poetry community. So thank you again. May you go forth and bring your best to the world.
Thank you, Nick.
Yeah, thanks, Larry. Larry's been a good supporter, so I want to say thank you to Larry too.
Yes, thank you, Larry.
For coming on the journey here and being such a great friend.
My honor and pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, with that, we'll call it quits.
Thank you. Thank you, Nick.
Have a beautiful day, everybody.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everybody.